Folks, this is Screen Watching. It's our weekly look at what we've been watching on screens. My name's Dan. I'll be joined in just a moment by Simon. Now, interestingly, during the week, there was a bit of news around what was surprisingly an introspective text from one Tucker Carlson, where he was saying all sorts of stuff, but whatever. But one of the things that everyone really picked up on was a incredibly racist phrase he used in there, which was something about how that's not how white men fight. And so I've been left thinking, how do white men fight? And then I realized they talk about TV shows and movies on podcasts. Folks, this is Screen Watching.
This is not like TV, only better.
Television! Teacher! Mother!
Secret lover.
What, that's it? That's your movie?
Well, I said that I had an idea for a movie.
You know, I said it at the top. This is Screen Watching. My name's Dan Barrett, joined by Simon Foster. We talk about the TV shows and movies of the week, and then whatever else comes to mind. Simon, you're well. I assume you're still in your holiday mode of whatever it is you're doing there, claiming you're at a film festival, claiming you're doing
exactly
work
right.
while you're there, but who can say for sure?
Look at this. It's early in the morning. It's a beautiful day here in Coffs Harbour. Good morning, Dan Barrett. Good morning, all our screen watchers out there. Yes, it has been a very busy week, and I've just noticed I've got quite the bedhead going on, so do forgive me. The morning was going great. I got up nice and early to do this podcast, and everything was moving along. And then 3 minutes before we clicked record, I realised that I'd got Vegemite on my phone screen. The iPhone is now smeared with Australia's favourite food of sorts, and I've got no way of getting it off my phone screen. I'm worried I'm going to have to lick my phone screen.
I was going to say, you've got a tongue. Like, how is this even a problem?
Well, it's the phone screen. It's got like weeks and weeks of, it's like a history of my fingers' bacteria on there, and I've got to lick the Vegemite off. Anyway, this has started off quite unsavoury.
I'm thinking if you've got Vegemite on your fingers, you're probably licking it off there anyway, and God knows where those fingers have been. Let's not even go there. Folks, let's dive straight into some reviews.
It stinks.
Okay, Simon, I've got quite a few things on my docket this week. It is a big week for stuff.
It is,
Look, on
it
my
is a
docket
big
this
week for stuff.
Yeah, look, coming up for me, I've got a bit of a comedy sandwich. I've got a comedy called Bupkis. It stars Pete Davidson. And then I'm squeezing a drama in the middle, a sci-fi drama from Apple TV Plus. It's called Silo. And then I'm putting another little layer of sandwich in there, the top level of sandwich. And it's a new comedy drama thing, a dramedy, I think the kids call it. It's called Split.
Beautiful.
It stars Zoe Lister-Jones, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. But Simon, you got some fairly big titles here as well, including one you should have done weeks ago, but here we are.
Yes, that's exactly right. The big movie in cinemas this week is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, which we'll be checking out. Then I got a little, in limited release, a little Swiss film called Olga about a Ukrainian gymnast. I'm looking forward to talking about that. And then,
Beautiful
yes,
name.
you're absolutely right. 2 weeks after it hit cinemas, I'm finally getting to review BEAU Is Afraid, which closed out the Screenway Film Festival last night up here in soon-to-be sunny Coffs Harbour. And boy, I've got some choice words to say about that as well. And it is going to be a very, as you've written here in beautiful English, spoiler-o-rama-rama. So yes, you're right. It's a film that we definitely need to discuss. Let's get on with this.
Yeah, look, before we do it, I just want to say with BEAU Is Afraid, I saw this a few weeks ago. It's kind of a conversation-proof movie. It is impossible to talk about, but you can do it if you have some pretty severe spoilers involved in that conversation. So if you haven't seen it and you're super keen to see it, you might want to skip our conversation. But also, I would say that hopefully, maybe if you hear the spoiler conversation, you might be more inclined to sit in a cinema. You've had a few weeks. You clearly haven't done that. And also, when it's hitting home media, you're never going to watch this movie. You're not going to make it past the first 5 minutes. So let's just embrace this for what it is, and we're going to go full hog spoilers. Anyway,
and those of you, I was going to say, those of you familiar with the podcast will know how to skip ahead. So BEAU Is Afraid may be the time to do it.
Simon, we all saw King of Staten Island. I don't know how true that is. But Pete Davidson, star of that Judd Apatow comedy, has gone off to make his own TV show that feels very much like King of Staten Island. It's called Bupkis.
We unanimous.
Is that Pete Davidson?
Wanted to spend a little time with my grandson. That's what it's all about.
You're not supposed to smoke here.
What are you, a forest ranger?
Time to free my mind of limitation.
Peter!
Mom?
Does Dave know you have his Klingon sword?
It's a glaive, and no, he doesn't.
I think people's enjoyment of Bupkis will really depend on how much they can stomach Pete Davidson. I don't mind him, but I have to say, King of Staten Island was like about a 12-hour movie or something, or at least felt that way. It was like a good 2.5 to 3 hours. It was a long film for a comedy. I made it about 90 minutes into that film and I tapped out. I left the cinema, could not make it anymore. I tweeted about this and some guy's like, oh, it got so much better in the second hour. You left just as it got good. And I'm thinking, I was there for 90 minutes. I gave it enough of a go. Okay, so look, my tolerance for Pete Davidson, obviously, I'm not such a fanboy. I could last out King of Staten Island. I know that some people really like that film. It just wasn't for me. So the idea of him doing a half-hour series, I'm like, I could do half an hour of Pete Davidson. And I certainly found that this show, it's perfectly fine. But can I remind you of a little film called There's Something About Mary? Okay, and if you've seen the first opening sequence of Bupkis, you'll know where I'm heading with this one. But There's Something About Mary. There was a iconic sequence. What was Something About Mary, 1998? 97, 98? Thereabouts.
Yes, 97, I do believe.
Yeah, I feel I was in high school still when that came out, just making Simon feel older. Now,
Thank you.
1997, there was a sequence where it's the best known sequence in the film. Ben Stiller is, as one may say, taking care of business. There's a bit of byproducts and it ends up in his hair. It's like the hair gel scene. Everyone knows that film. Everyone sat in the cinema. We laughed uproariously. We held our sides. People fell off their chairs laughing. There were weasels who were falling over dying and you could see the ghosts going up. People were really into that scene. It was very funny and we all saw it. The thing is that sort of gross out humor, I kind of feel that in the 25 years since There's Something About Mary, we've kind of seen a lot of that and there's not really much more you can do that really feels like it's particularly special. So when Bupkis opens with an extended sequence with Pete Davidson's character, who's Pete Davidson, but not Pete Davidson, but is also very much Pete Davidson, wearing a VR helmet, taking care of business, and he's living in his mother's house for some reason. She ends up coming downstairs to the basement where he is. He doesn't know she's there because, he's got a headset on. And then the action happens and it ends up all over her shirt. And we're all supposed to be much the same way as we did during Something About Mary, holding our sides, doing the laughing. The thing is, we saw that, it's that just kind of feels a bit lame now. It's socially awkward. I get that. But, I kind of feel as screen entertainment, a little bit dull. And that's kind of the overall vibe of the series. It's a lot of very much, we've seen this, we've been there, we've done that. It's very much Pete Davidson doing his half-hour version where it seems like every comedian wants to do their version of Curb Your Enthusiasm, not necessarily with the improv, but certainly with them at the center of, whatever situations are going on, which is how sitcoms have always worked, I guess. But, there seems to be a very sort of Curbish flavor that seems to run through a lot of these. And the thing is, I'm watching this and I'm like, why would I watch this program when I could just watch The Superior Dave instead, which is a show doing very similar things, but so much better executed, so much more engaging, and also actually funny. It's got a good cast. It's got Pete Davidson in the lead, and he's perfectly good being Pete Davidson. Edie Falco plays his mum. It kind of feels like she's maybe too old to play his mum, but I don't know how true that is. I'm not sure exactly how old Edie Falco is. Maybe she was a bit younger playing the mum in The Sopranos than I realized, but it kind of feels like she was the mum of, teenagers going into 20-somethings when I was watching TV 25 years ago, 23 years ago, Sopranos. It just kind of feels like maybe she's sort of not quite right for this. And Joe Pesci's in there as well for some reason.
Yeah, look, it's one of these shows, and the other one that I've been reading a little bit about in comparison to Bupkis is the Louis C.K. show before he went off the boil. It sort of gives a very carefully sort of constructed version of a real life comedian that the comedian himself is in charge of, and that often can lead to, I guess, accusations of it being just them trying to mold their image in a way that builds their brand and builds their popularity going forward. And I think what Bupkis does is very much play upon him being we exactly expect Pete Davidson to be the sort of person who masturbates in his mother's cellar and makes a mess on her to finish off. And obviously that isn't real, but that's how he wants us to see him. So there's a self-serving aspect to this show that I found a little bit on the nose. Great to see Joe Pesci back on screen. Not great to see him sort of reduced just to riffing with Pete Davidson and not really being given a whole lot to do. And it plays out, that whole first episode plays out with a joke involving Brad Garrett that I just didn't think was that funny. In fact, I thought the woman playing the prostitute was probably the best thing in this first episode. And good luck to her for making that work. But when that's your takeaway from the first episode of the series, I wasn't outwardly impressed with this one. So this one may be just for fans only. And I know they're out there, but not my thing.
Yeah, look, my biggest takeaway was that the lady who played the worker, ultimately I'd like to see her in some sort of comedy where she's the sister of Katie Sagal, because both of them have a very similar vibe to them, and I think it'd play off each other well. Beyond that, I got nothing really too much that I want to say too positively about this. It's fine. People have a worse time with other shows, but, Anyway, Simon, let's move on. What are you doing? Guardians of the Galaxy. That's a big movie playing in cinemas right now.
I'm gonna tell you something. I'm Star-Lord. I formed the Guardians. Met a girl, fell in love. That girl died, but then she came back. Came back a total dick.
Yes, that's right, Dan Barrett. The third of the series in Guardians of the Galaxy is upon us. The big MCU release this week. They seem to come on a fairly semi-regular basis, I've noticed. I have a sort of an opinion about the third in the series. If anything good has happened, it's usually happened by the third film in the series, not because of the third film in the series. And yes, there are those that sort of argue that maybe the third Lord of the Rings film, if you're into that kind of thing, was the best of the series. But generally, it's more Return of the Jedi than it is Lord of the Rings, Return of the King. So what we get with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is that they've settled into life on this floating rock in space. Things are turned upside down when an attack comes from a character which I understand is quite popular in the comics and quite a big deal in the comics, but who I didn't recognise, played by Will Poulter. He lays to waste this outpost and in the process desperately injures Rocket Raccoon, which sets in motion an adventure that takes the Guardians back to a faraway outpost to try to find the secrets of how to save Rocket. He is discovered to have a device on his heart that will kill him, a kill device, I guess you could say, and they have to try to find the code to that. And that sets in motion all the different aspects of this film, which I'm not going to get bogged down in describing the plot because the film certainly does, and I don't want to do that here. What I loved about the Guardians all the way through this was that it was almost a counterpoint to what MCU was doing. There was a real sort of ponderous heavy-handedness and a self-importance that came with the MCU films for much of the last decade or so, whereas the Guardians were able to bring a lighthearted, goofy touch to it, very much reflecting James Gunn's sense of humour and visual style. Here in the third one, it's been succumbed by the MCU mood. There's this really sort of heavy-handed feel about this third film and very manipulative feel as to the emotions in it that make it just another MCU film, and that's not what I've ever said about any of the other Guardians of the Galaxy films. The central character here is Rocket Raccoon. The first half of this film features some truly nightmarish images. I said in a post during the week that animal vivisection is not the sort of plot device you'll want to see in your comic book film, and some of the stuff is certainly James Gunnish, harkening back to his time as a Troma director, but I don't know what it's doing in an MCU film, and I found it really sort of nightmarish. And to your example of my experience, your experience in a cinema when you see some of this, I had a couple of families walk out in that early sequence because it was just too scary for their littlies. So I'm keen to get your opinion on this as someone with a bit more of a comic book bent, but for me, I found this a real slog at 2.5 hours and not the fun I expected to have with the Guardians of the Galaxy film.
Well, look, I mean, I'd probably start and contend a little bit that I feel that the conversation about Guardians of the Galaxy being a fun sort of goofy romp is a little bit overstated. So the very first Guardians film, I think, is huge fun for that first sort of 40-odd minutes where you got the sort of sad moment at the beginning, the death of Peter Quill's mum, goes into space, and then it becomes like a fun sort of AM radio-influenced music extravaganza or, silliness through space. But about halfway through that, it becomes a lot more serious and sort of falls into that more sort of dour Marvel staple. The second film I actually think is downright unwatchable. I really hated that second film. I just found there was nothing really particularly fun or engaging about it. The lightheartedness that I enjoyed from that first one wasn't present in that second one at all. And then there was like a 45-minute sort of special effects extravaganza right at the end, which was just impossible to follow in terms of visual styling. I just found that second one to be a complete mess of a movie and just really struggled with it. So when this one came along, and I think that the film is incredibly coherent from a narrative structure from beginning to end, and that sounds like faint praise, but considering where the previous two films have sort of come from, like, I think it's worth noting. I think it's got a very strong structure, probably a better structure than most Marvel films generally tend to have. I think that the characters are obviously by this third film, and don't forget they've also made appearances in a whole bunch of other Marvel films along the way, as well as the James Gunn written and directed Christmas special that came out a few months ago. Christmas, funnily enough.
I remember
when that came out, like, there's a real sense that these are lived-in characters at this point, and I really enjoyed that about this movie. It really felt like we're watching some characters that have proper experience together, and it's not that fake sort of movie thing where you can tell the actors have met 3 days beforehand and so have to pretend that they've been in love for years. Like, that's not really there. These people have genuine relationships together, and the character of Rocket. I think if you are planning to take a family to this, you only want to go with older teenagers because there are some very distressing scenes relating to the Rocket character. And I'm an animal lover. I really struggled with a lot of those scenes, but I came out through the other end of it. And I'm kind of glad that I went through that because there's this character who has clearly been through a lot of physical trauma in the past, clearly has mental trauma that he's been trying to suppress. And to actually go through that with him, it wasn't just lip service. We really saw what this poor character has been through. So as we reach the final sort of sequence where, much like Lord of the Rings, we've got a couple of endings sort of at the end of this movie, but I actually found it to be a really cathartic moment when I reached the end. There's a sequence involving the Peter Quill character that I don't think is entirely earned and just kind of falls a little bit flat. But all the stuff with Rocket particularly, by the end of it, I was deeply emotionally invested in this in a way I had not expected to be by any means. I went into this film expecting to have similar reactions to those first two films, but by the end I was won over by this movie. I was genuinely into it, and the position that they have Rocket at the very end in, I'd kind of like to see more of that. It doesn't necessarily need to be a movie. It could be a TV series, it could be an animated show, but I want to see that next stage of his life because I'm fully invested now.
Okay, we're in different camps on this one because I found the use of the Gamora character, Zoe Saldana's character, and her relationship with Quill to be just without any meat on the bones. I thought it was
I wouldn't disagree. I think that's probably the weakest part of the movie.
Yeah, and I got to say, I thought it had a deep space sort of darkness about it, which sucked a lot of the fun out of the special effects. A lot of these MCU films sort of end with the big swarm of flying monkey sort of type of characters attacking the heroes, and that certainly goes down this path. There's a real familiarity about this, and I haven't said that about the other Gunn directed films. So dare I say that it takes on a sort of Snyder-esque look to it. Certainly not in the characters or the dialogue, but in some of the action, I would certainly put it in that vein. So maybe DC is exactly the right place for him.
I don't know. I could stomach this where Zack Snyder's superhero stuff, maybe not so much. So
clearly, it's not going to make any difference what we say. It's already open to a franchise best 3-day total or 2-day total in the US as we record this, and probably doing the same all over the world. So good luck to your MCU. We wish you all the best with your latest venture.
Okay, Simon, let's talk very quickly about Silo because we need to get through these reviews quicker than we have been. Sure. Silo, it's a brand new TV show from one Apple TV Plus.
We do not know why we are here. We do not know who built the silo and why we are underground. We only know the world outside our sanctuary is death.
I was a bit concerned about Silo. I'd seen the trailer and it looked kind of promising. This is an Apple TV Plus show which has a fairly lavish set. What the set is, let me give the blurb for what the show is and we can talk about that set, because it really is the star of this show. In a ruined and toxic future, a community exists in a large underground silo that plunges hundreds of stories deep. People live in a society full of regulations that they believe are meant to protect them. So you've got all these people. It could be thousands, it could be hundreds of thousands. I don't think they really sort of are clear enough as to exactly the scope and scale of this. But we do know that to travel between floors can sometimes take like a day or two to do so. So it's a big structure that they're all living in this underground thing. You've got this cast, Rebecca Ferguson, Rashida Jones in there, Tim Robbins, David Oyelowo. Wow. There's,
quality cast.
Monster of a cast. Very quality cast, quality set. So this set that they're in, like you're watching it, and it feels a little bit too much like a set to my taste. Like it's just kind of, I wouldn't say the show's overlit because it's certainly not, but it's sort of overlit to hide that it isn't a set. So anyway, it kind of looks like a set. It's not quite as grimy as I think it probably should be, but that's just maybe a personal aesthetic sort of taste thing. But you've got these people living in there, and they are of the understanding that if you end up leaving this silo, there's something outside, maybe some sort of radiation or something, that is going to kill you within a few minutes of leaving. They know this because there's screens all over the place that show what's happening outside. And every so often, when people end up saying that they want to leave, people aren't told that they have to stay. Okay, they strongly suggest that they stay, but they're welcome to leave if they want. So when people leave, they're asked to go outside and clean the cameras so that people can continue to see the outside world. So it's like asking them to do that final sort of act of altruism for the community. Anyway, when someone ends up leaving the silo, people watch on the screens as they leave. They'll wipe the screen and then you usually see their body topple over as they get a little bit further out. As the first episode has it, you've got the David Oyelowo character and Rashida Jones. The two of them are a couple that have been trying to have a kid for some time, but you need to apply to be able to have a kid. So anyway, they've been given approval and they're struggling like nothing's really happening after half a year. And so Rashida Jones starts asking some questions, which is along the lines of, does the government actually want me having a kid? And so she starts following that line of inquiry and leads to the decision she wants to leave the silo. So anyway, she ends up leaving the silo. We see her body topple over in like a spacesuit, so it's not entirely clear it's her. You can't see a bit of her face, but something's certainly amiss. And we've jumped 3 years later to see that David Oyelowo, distraught over the passing of his wife, is now being led to a very similar conclusion that maybe something is not necessarily entirely above board in what they're being told. The tension in this, it's pretty good. It's a really good production. I can easily see this being a show where people are coming back to it week after week and buzz on it will build. Like, it's certainly a show that's going to have that. But I was sitting there with a very specific thought, and my wife was watching it with me and said the exact same thing just a minute or two before I was about to say it out loud, which was, why is this not a movie? Like, it's just one of these things where it's certainly a high concept idea, but does this need to be a serialized drama that we're watching for 8 to 10 weeks? And the answer is very much no. But the writing on it's pretty strong. It's Graham Yost, who he's written all sorts of things over the years, but like Speed, the movie back in the day, Justified, he's had his hands in some pretty good TV and movies over the years. This is well handled. It's an adaptation of a series of books by Hugh Howey. I don't know if you've read the books, whether you'll be a fan of the way they've executed this, but it seems pretty good to me. But ultimately, I just kind of get stuck with this idea of, do I need to see 10 hours of this? And it's a stretched out story that I'm not sure it needs to be. But that's my only real criticism of it. It's quite good.
Boy, Apple TV are really pulling some big name showrunners over their series at the moment, with the Yost on board with this, and the guy who did Extrapolations, and the guys who've done.
They've got
they're
the
pulling
money.
in some. Yeah, they've clearly got the money. It's I don't know this one. I haven't seen this one, but with the cast like that and that sort of premise, which does seem a bit familiar to a fan of sci-fi, it's sort of the underground world. They don't tell them they're up. That sort of, I get what this is. I get what the setup here with his straight away. So how they put a different spin on it, I'm keen to see. Silo is on Apple TV.
That is correct.
Olga is a film I'm going to have a look at. It's in limited release. Let's have a look at a clip.
Je vous présente Olga, elle fera la préparation des compétitions avec nous.
Pourquoi t'es ici? À ma mère, à cause de son travail.
That clip will be fun for people who are only listening to this podcast, because it's all in Ukrainian. This is a film, let me put a quick bit of backstory to this. In 2013 in Kiev, there was a huge uprising called the Maidan Revolution, and it was one of the first revolutions. It was driven by social media. Young people of all ages, I guess, were spreading the news of this revolution as it happened. It sort of inspired the Arab Spring movement. It also inspired Putin's hatred of the Ukraine and is considered one of the early warning signs that the country would become a target of Putin's Russia. The personal story involved in this is about a gymnast, I should say, played by real-life gymnast, and I want to get this name right because she's extraordinary in the film, Anastasia Buryashkina. She has dual citizenship, not only Ukrainian, but her father's Swiss, so she's able to leave the country because her mother is a journalist and is being targeted by the Putin-friendly regime. As she heads to Switzerland to continue her training, she suddenly finds herself a Ukrainian by heart and mind, but exiled in Switzerland, not able to speak her native tongue, banned from speaking Russian because no one understands it. The other girls all speak German, so she's leading this very lonely life while also trying to make the World Championship gymnastics team. So what you have here is a very personal story about a young woman's coming of age and a young woman sort of having to live alone for the first time in her life, set against the high-tension world of high-class gymnastics, while also being set against the world of a country in turmoil and her being separated from that. So there's a lot of really great sort of dramatic tension being pulled along the way. Directed by Eli Grapp, who is a young filmmaker making his first film. The sports sequences are stunning. They're shot in a way that puts you right in the middle of her struggles as a gymnast. The use of YouTube footage and cell phone footage to recount for her what's happening as the revolution unfolds in her homeland is all real footage, all taken from the very well documented Maidan Uprising that's cut into the film in a really convincing way. But for someone who's never acted before, this Anastasia Buryashkina is just intensely powerful in the lead role. This one's in limited release, and we do have an interview with the director over on our YouTube channel, and I encourage you to have a look. He's an incredibly well-spoken young man and gives some great insight into this character. But the film itself is quite an achievement, and I do recommend getting along to seeing it in cinemas where you can find it. It's called Olga, in limited release.
Simon, I want to talk to you about a show which, look, this will be probably the first time you've ever heard about this program and quite possibly the last time you ever hear about this program. And that's not a reflection of its quality. It's just that it's an underground TV show that just nobody's going to know exists, which is a bit sad. It's called Slip.
I didn't want to wake up this morning. I just always feel like being asleep. Like life is a dream.
Love you.
Love you. Where nothing really happens.
Yeah, I was just asking how you're doing as like more of a courtesy.
Oh, right.
Slip is a series of 6 half-hour episodes, so, 25, 27 minutes apiece. It's written by Zoe Lister-Jones. It's directed by Zoe Lister-Jones. And wait for it, Simon, it stars Zoe Lister-Jones. Now, if people don't know Zoe Lister-Jones, people have probably seen her in shows like New Girl. She was a regular cast member of Life in Pieces. She's one of these people that have regularly appeared in some fairly sort of hip sitcoms and indie films over the years. She has directed a couple of things at this point. I think she was the director of the Craft film that came out a couple of years ago. I don't know if it was a sequel to the Craft.
Okay, so this is all falling into place.
Yeah.
I said to my wife at the time that I've seen all these letters put together somewhere, but I just don't know who this Zoe Lister-Jones is. Yeah. So, do continue.
Yeah, she's certainly been around and, a known screen presence, even if not necessarily a household name by this point. She's starring in this program. She's playing this character named May. She's fairly restless in her marriage. It's basically a marriage where they've been together for years. Like, they love each other, but like the spark just isn't really quite there anymore. And so they've kind of settled into a routine. They don't have any kids, and it's kind of just this couple that's sort of going through the motions at this point. As the show sort of starts, she's sort of questioning it all and doesn't really quite feel right. At the very end of the episode, she makes her first slip, which is having an affair. So it's like a one-night stand, and she doesn't really mean for that to happen. It's just kind of something that ends up happening. Wakes up the next morning in both regret as well as in an alternate reality. the guy that she's gone home with, suddenly she finds that this person she's married to now and doesn't really understand where she is, what this is. So she has to work out the parameters of her new life and also work out, do I necessarily want to be here? And in the same way, her relationship wasn't working previously. It's not working again. End of the episode, she ends up sleeping with someone else. Suddenly, entirely different alternate reality. She's in an entirely different situation. But each time that she ends up jumping to these new realities after sleeping with someone, it's really addressing an element of her life that wasn't really necessarily quite working. And so she's forced to confront that. In the way that I look at something like Silo, where I'm like, is this necessarily a movie premise or a TV series? This to me feels like something which could be a movie premise, but is much better as a series because you got the serialized aspect where every episode can approach this from a different perspective, and there's actually considerable value to coming to this episodically. I then look at something like this, which it feels human. It feels as though she's actually really going through some stuff. Compare that to Bupkis, and they're both half-hour comedies, but one of them actually feels like something you want to connect to, that one being Slip. And then Bupkis, it's kind of it's wallpaper television. Slip is a good, emotional, human, relatable TV program, but the one criticism I would give for this program is that Zoe Lister-Jones, as a screen performer, certainly the case in New Girl, certainly the case in most things that I've seen her in, she plays things very icy. She's someone who's sort of too cool to be in the room that she's in, even if she isn't necessarily, but she certainly, her sense of self, her presence, is always that she's kind of a little bit above everything that's going on. I feel that she is someone who, she's certainly someone who's done a lot of comedies over time, but I don't know that she's necessarily a overtly funny person, even if she looks at the world through a funny lens. So in this show, particularly in the very first episode, where she's made the choice to do some very broad things, there's a sequence in the first episode, she has to get around a security guard and things are amped up in a way which kind of wouldn't feel out of place in something like Bupkis or any sort of other sort of broadish sort of themed comedy. It doesn't really work. It seems completely counter to who she is and what her screen presence is. And it feels as though who they're trying to appeal to with something like a sequence like that is not the sort of person who wants to stick around with a TV program like this sort of broadly. I kind of wish that the show had just a little bit more integrity about itself and played it just a bit more seriously, or just sort of really reveled in some of the sort of darker comedic elements rather than trying to go broad. But if you get past a couple of those sequences, which aren't overtly on the nose, but they're just kind of, just kind of wish the show was doing a little bit better than it is during those times. It's really good TV. I kind of hope that more people check it out. It's not going to make my end of year best list, but it's something which I certainly feel is a really rewarding watch. And, I'm certainly getting emotionally invested as the series goes on. I've seen the first 3 of 6, and I'll certainly watch the other 3 before the weekend's out.
Yeah, I'm in for 2 episodes so far, and I don't disagree with anything you say. I think it's a film. I think it's a series that it sets up its premise really well. I thought that opening sequence in the first episode was really well done and really well put together. I also agree that she's an unusual screen presence. It's not easy to warm to her, but maybe in the course of selling the premise and selling the idea for this, we need someone who's a little bit off kilter, who's a little bit different to your sitcom lead, because it is a show that sort of embraces something both a bit deeper, but also those moments, like you say, the moment with the barista at one point, or the coffee shop girl, and the and getting past the security guard. So it has its broad stuff as well. I must admit, when the parallel universe thing unfolded, I was caught a little bit by surprise, and I thought the second episode played well into that. So I'm kind of in as well, and she reminded me a little bit of Diana Agron from the Glee series, and she's made a lot of indie films along the way. She's got that same sort of I'll take in what's going on around me, then choose how I decide to react kind of feel to her.
Yeah.
And so I'm sort of on board with Slip like you. I didn't know it was only 6 episodes, so I think that's probably just about right for a series like this.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I'd be surprised if this is built to continue, but we'll see what happens when it plays out at the end. Probably worth noting just about Zoe Lister-Jones is that you refer to her as off-kilter. I don't think that's necessarily quite right, but she's certainly not a type of screen presence that we see a lot, particularly leading something. And when you, I don't know that much about the real woman outside of having heard her on a very interesting WTF podcast with Mark Maron. And when she was on that, she was talking about her real life relationship. She was in an open marriage with this guy who was a film director, and just a really interesting, open, very sex-positive person, which is very much reflected through this TV program. I think she's just not the sort of person we get to see usually lead a TV program. She's not warm and overly... I don't even know what to really say. Like, but she is engaging though. Like, it's a unique sort of screen presence she has, only because she's so unusual on screen, but not because she's an unusual person. Just that we don't get to see her usually.
All right, we've worked up to it. This is the spoiler-rich review of Beau is Afraid.
I am so sorry for what your daddy passed down to you. But I wanted a child, the greatest gift of my life.
Okay, Simon, do you want to try to explain in like 30 seconds or less what this movie's about?
I knew you were going to throw that to me. Joaquin Phoenix. I'm going to do this off the top of my head because I should point out, like I said, I've just seen this overnight. I've literally woken up after going to bed having just watched this. So, Beau Wasserman, played by Joaquin
Sorry, can I
Phoenix.
just ask a question? Have you technically stopped watching it?
Images of it still haven't left my head, trust me. He is a, I guess, 40-something man who has a very strained, complex relationship with his mother that is examined in depth over the course of his journey in this nearly 3-hour film. He lives alone in an apartment in this sort of otherworldly type section of a big metropolis that is pitched so high and is so loud and full of so much horrendous forms of humanity that it would drive anyone mad.
If you watch Fox News and hear them talk about the failed state of San Francisco or any of these other large cities which are so overly riddled with crime, the picture they paint of this sort of crime hellscape is very much what's brought to the screen here. It's an over-the-top idea of just people wandering the streets, just being violent and just awful to one another.
So the basic plot is that he has to get back home after he learns of his mother's passing. What that does is takes him on a Homer-like odyssey through his life and different parts of American society that may or may not exist, or that take on a kind of Kafka-esque, nightmarish form in one way or another. Clearly, I'm struggling with what this film is in a capsule synopsis. Suffice to say that it is a journey inside the mind of a man riddled with Jewish guilt, maternal claws stuck in him as he grew older, and a whole lot of memories that are slowly eating him away inside. So if that sounds like a fun 3 hours for you, knock yourself out. Dan, what did you think of the film?
So I really liked this movie, and I left the cinema thinking that I liked it, but I wasn't entirely sure. And as the 2 weeks now I've sort of followed, I really appreciate it more and more. Could I ever sit through this movie again? I'm not so sure. And not because it's a boring chore of a movie to get through. It's just that it's a film that takes its time and doesn't really reveal much of a point to it until the end, where you kind of have to appreciate the total of its various parts. Each sequence, because it's kind of split into like about 3 or 4 sort of key sequences, each sequence is interesting in its own sort of standalone state, but I guess as a viewer, you're trying to work out where the coherence is between section to section and what it all means and where we're going with it. And I think it's just a matter of me as a viewer, I was just feeling a little bit sort of antsy in my seat because I couldn't work out where we were going and if we were ever going to get there. This opening sequence in the city is just completely mind-boggling. While I was watching it, I was like, how on earth is this going to be a movie for 3 hours? And like the level of tension, the level of just sheer, like suddenly you're just being thrown into this world, and it's not even engagement, Simon. Like it's kind of like you've been dropped into a pit and you're just like crawling the walls of the cinema to try to find the top of this.
It's true.
It's a really unique film. Now, Simon, we said we'd talk about spoilers. I want to give the biggest spoiler on it, which is this is what I think is happening in the movie. Okay, and like maybe this is overt, but I've talked to a few people now, and everyone sort of thought, I haven't really thought about that at all, but to me it was pretty clear. At the very beginning of the film, he's handed like some new experimental drugs from his therapist, And then that's the most sort of grounded we see this character at all during the entire movie. And that's only a sequence that runs for, 4 minutes at best. After that, like, we start seeing him go through this hellscape where everything just seems like it's not turned up to 11, it's like turned up to 44. And it seems like everything's around him. We're watching this guy going through a drug-addled experience around the world, and everything we're seeing is just a exceedingly hyper version of what's really happening to him in real life, to the point where he's not even acknowledging sort of what's going on. The big tell is in one of the early sequences. He's lying there in bed through the night, and he can't sleep because there's someone who keeps on shoving notes under his door telling him to turn down the stereo. He's there thinking, I don't have a stereo that's on. What is happening? He thinks he's being, harassed by one of his neighbors. I think he does have a stereo on, but he just doesn't understand because he's just so out of it, sort of in terms of the drug-addled state that he's in. And so you're sort of seeing this sort of sequence play out for 3 hours. He's going through hyper-realistic moment, and it's all because of this drug thing. To me, that's kind of clearly what's going on, but I don't know if you read that at all, or if your brain has even caught up to like that part now, because it is such an experience.
Yeah, that opening sequence is extraordinary, and I agree with you in that this is not a world that exists in a normal reality. It is clearly a world that spews out of his neurosis and spews out of his sort of internalization of his guilt and his anger and his fears and all those things that weaken him as a man. So yes, I get that it kind of Jacob's ladders us a little bit in that this is all happening in his head, and this may be the result of those drugs that he took, or that he died at some point, and we're seeing this as an afterlife story, all those sort of things. So I get that it could be doing that. The opening sequence to me in the city, I thought, was a beautifully structured piece that had a whole lot of these elements, like the spider, like the tattooed man, like the needing water to take the drugs, getting out the door without his keys. It was kind of almost like a classic sort of sketch expanded with all these different elements that finally saw his undoing. And I wanted that sort of little bit of structure to hang on to in the rest of the film, because by the time it gets to the forest with the pregnant woman and the play they're putting on, and then it gets to the long sequence with Patti LuPone at the mother's house, and then the boat sequence, all this sort of stuff.
And let's not forget Parker Posey.
Oh my God, Parker Posey. And so I had forgotten about Parker Posey. And I should point out, I think that's why it was those scenes that probably led it to an R rating as well. So not to mention his distended testicles, which play a increasingly important part in the film. Oh my God, I can't believe I've said that on the podcast. So yes, this is a very strange film that challenges its audience in a way that few films have in the past. It's kind of like the 2001: A Space Odyssey of Jewish guilt, in that it takes this as a core
movie
structure.
Poster quote.
There's your poster quote. So look, yes, I'm glad these sort of films exist. Is it easy to watch? No. Is it going to stay with me for a long time? Yes. And I'm going to be thinking of it in 2 weeks' time, just like you are now. So I guess that's a good thing. Is it hugely successful as a film? I don't know if it is. Ari Aster, whose name we haven't even mentioned yet, but he's made some divisive films to date with Hereditary and Midsommar, and this will be his most divisive yet. So, yeah, good luck, everyone.
Yeah, I actually think this film is magnificent. I am so on board with this movie now. In fact, I think I actually could go to the cinema and watch it again.
Wow, that is a huge call, because I think you said it's never boring. There were some parts that were certainly confusing and confusing to the point of it taking me out of the film. So there were moments that I thought were indulgent, but indulgent in a way that was a filmmaker and a storyteller really challenging themselves with this kind of material. So that's always a plus. But if I am going to see it again, I am going to see it at the movies. You're absolutely right. This is not a home viewing item.
Yeah, because you can easily be distracted by everything else in the world. In fact, you'll be looking for anything to be distracted by.
All right, BEAU is Afraid is probably still in cinemas. I don't think it's going to cross over to. It had a huge opening in America for an art house title in the main
coastal cities. I don't know if it's going to challenge Guardians of the Galaxy at the box office in the weeks ahead, but do try and get along to see it if you're in the mood for something totally bizarre.
And just a warning, a heads up to people, if you aren't aware of this movie at all, it has been out in the cinema for about 2 or 3 weeks now. So Palace and Dendy, those sorts of theatres, they'll still be playing it for a few more weeks. Weirdly, it was playing in event cinemas, and I just don't understand how an event cinema audience is turning up to Beau is Afraid. I'd imagine there were probably quite a few refunds.
Wow. Yeah, well, it was a packed closing night last night at Swift here in Coffs Harbour, and there was a couple of walkouts within the first hour. Like they didn't even stick around for some of the really nutty stuff at the end. So it's a film that it's not going to be everyone's cup of tea.
You know what? I will say that I'm someone who checks my watch a fair bit while I'm watching a movie, not because I'm bored by the movie, but I appreciate structure to movie, and I like to know where we're at and just roughly sort of, are we in that sort of final act yet or any of that sort of business. Anyway, as I said, this film is never boring at any point, but I did look at my watch at one point and I thought, oh my God, 2 and a bit hours have flown by, and I was just completely taken by it. But then I actually realized I'd only been watching for half an hour.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, so that brings us to the end of the review segment. Oh my God, that was exhausting. Whew, well done. Good job. Let's get to the intermission.
Okay, Simon, intermission. Do you want to explain what's happening? Personally, I'm just going to sit here. I refuse to do it. I'm stepping out. I'm on strike for the next 30 seconds while you explain what's happening here.
Well, you better not be, because I came to this section after your fascinating and very incisive newsletter, Always Be Watching newsletter during the week, in which you broke down many of the key points of the Writers Guild strike. It's a big deal over in the US. The Writers Guild of America, both the East and West Coast divisions, are having their first strike after 15 years. When it last happened, Hollywood ground to a halt. And this time they've down pens again to fight the unfair pay conditions that exist largely in the world of the streaming sector. And they've started to throw in a few of the issues concerning AI script writing as well and storytelling. So there's a few sort of things bubbling along there. I thought we don't want to go over it in depth too much, but we should have a look at the bullet point issues that they're fighting about, and maybe have a look at the impact this will have on our viewing habits going forward. And you made the good point that a lot of stuff's in the can. It's probably not going to change television too much, certainly in terms of scripted dramas in the weeks ahead. But we can expect all our talk shows to go quiet, to shutter, as they say in the biz, which is already happening. What's your take on it, Dan?
Okay, quick spiel. This is what the writers are after. This is what the studios want to say no to. Writers want more money. That's standard sort of negotiation when it comes to re-signing these sort of agreements, though. They want to protect the writers' room. So at the moment, what happens is you got companies like Netflix that came along, and instead of having a pilot and then staffing it up with a room going forward, what they'll usually do is hire a couple of writers to break out most of the episodes. And sometimes these are fully written scripts. Sometimes these are just very detailed outlines as to what's happening. And then when they actually commission the show to go forward, they'll then hire fewer writers than they usually do to work with that pre-prepared material and then write those out into full scripts. So what they call them is mini rooms rather than a full writer's room, which they used to have. So instead of having, say, 12 writers on a series, you might just have 3 writers on a series. So they can really compress this down a fair bit. 3 is definitely on the smaller side of things, but whatever. They're also leaning more towards that idea of the one single sort of author who's really writing all the scripts if they can try to get production and heading that direction. Thereafter that, the writers are also concerned about the rise of AI. So they want to make sure there's written protections in place that studios won't be using AI generated material for scripts going forward. And then what's the other thing that they're after? They'd like to know more transparency. Well, they'd like more transparency around viewership, because it's hard to negotiate your strength of position when you're trying to work out what your salary should be when you don't actually know how popular things have actually been versus,
exactly
what the assumption is. So that's what they're after. The studios are pushing back on most of that. And the reason for it is, if you think about all those issues that they're after, it kind of speaks to the heart of the changes that are happening in the industry and where everything's going. So they want a sense of protectionism in place, because a lot of the problems facing writers right now means that if you're a writer, you're not being paid anywhere near enough money to be able to get by. these are jobs which aren't like the sort of jobs that you and I have, Simon, or I mean me, where I'm working like a 9 to 5 job. I mean, you're all over the place. You do all sorts of weird freelance things. If anything, the job of a writer is more like what you're doing. But for me, I'm like most people where I've got a full-time job. I go there week in, week out. I make so much money throughout the year. What the writers do, however, is that they've got these jobs which might last for 2 to 3 months, and then I've got 4 months of unemployment, and then I've got like another short-term job again. And the thing is that when these jobs aren't paying enough money, it means that you don't have enough money to make it through these patches where you don't have the jobs coming through. And then also maybe as a writer, you've got like maybe 4 or 5 years where you're constantly working and putting yourself sort of through that ladder, but then maybe you find yourself with a 3-year period where things just go really fallow and you're just sort of out of the cycle. Because the thing with a lot of these jobs is that these are jobs you get through relationships and through just sort of general sort of negotiated positions from where you're at. If you have a bit of a gap in career, it's hard to get that happening again. So writers just want to be able to protect that. So we're in this position now where writers can't even afford really a middle-class lifestyle. You got the very few writers at the very top of the food chain who are making millions, if not tens of millions, if not $100 million for some of these guys. But the majority of them are struggling to get by, and they're just in credit card debt. They can't pay their rent. They can't pay their mortgage. Like, it's just a really dire position for a lot of these working, jobbing writers.
And I guess we should also point out that it's always been tough for the writer in Hollywood to negotiate sort of high-end figures. The ongoing cliche, the stereotype is that it's the writer that's always is short-shafted by a lot of this. But this has really sort of become apparent over the last few years with the multi-million-dollar profits that the streamers are showing, the huge sort of back ends that producers are getting. Whereas there was a statistic through the week, and I may not have the numbers right, but the actual sort of stats were there that the high-end producers' earnings, especially on some of the big streaming titles, has gone up an exorbitant amount in percentage-wise, whereas the average writer's salary has actually gone down 4%. So they're looking at that. The basis for the strike is this discrepancy between the success that the streamers and the producers of these shows are having with this new industry structure and the fact that the writers aren't seeing any of it.
Yeah, and like realistically, they're not actually after a huge amount of money, and they're not really after a huge amount of additional resources. It's actually pretty reasonable. Yeah. But anyway, I think probably the thing that's more interesting to people listening to a podcast like this who are outside of the biz is just how's this going to impact the TV viewing that they're currently engaging in. So ultimately, that question comes down to how long does this strike last? Immediately, the first sort of impacted shows are the late night talk shows. So things like your Colbert's, your Tonight Show, with various Jimmys and whatnot. All those shows.
Topical stuff that's written on the day, written on a day-to-day basis,
Absolutely. So those, as well as a few daytime TV programs like The Talk, for example, which I don't know if we get here in Australia. It doesn't matter. It's a terrible program regardless. But those shows effectively went dark on day one. Now, essentially, it's happened at a point where it's May, it's the end of the TV season, and a lot of those shows, they'll have new episodes running throughout the May to September period, but that's their non-rating season in the US. So what you find is that generally there's fewer episodes being published during that time anyway. So usually what would happen is that Colbert might be on for, say, 2 weeks through the end of May, going into June, and then might be off for 3 weeks and come back for another 2 to 3 weeks. You're just going to find that it's just going to be off. So expect none of those shows really to be back for like the next 3 months, I would assume. Okay, unless that writer strike ends and then they just kind of bring everyone back. Also included in that sorry, just 1 sec. It's inclusive of things like SNL as well and other weekly programs like Last Week Tonight with John Oliver.
Colbert made the point that without writers, you'd basically have a guy talking about Lord of the Rings and boats for an hour. That's that's Colbert's big takeaway from it. So, they're extraordinarily important. What I did find out through the week is that all these late night show writers, they're on 13-week contracts. So after 13 weeks, things are looked at and did you get enough jokes in? Were you good? Did you work well with the team? We're going to cut your contract after 13 weeks and bring someone new in. So that is a high tension world to live in anyway.
Yeah, look, absolutely. There's no one more jaded than someone who's lost their job after a late night chat show. Or at least so podcasters taught me. So other things that you'll probably expect to see is that Because this is happening at the end of the TV season, this is the time period where traditionally the broadcast networks have been either filming pilots, which happens less and less. There's a lot more shows being picked up for continuing seasons these days, or they follow more the Netflix model of having shows go straight to series. So there's fewer pilots being produced, but roughly about now is where those pilots are being evaluated, and those that are going to become series generally go into production within the next month or two. So by mid-July, you find that most of the new programs that are going to be up and running for the US broadcast season are going into production. But then you've got all the returning shows, which are also going into production roughly around that time. So if the strike's continuing up to that point, it means that a new TV season won't have any new episodes to go for the broadcast shows. So you're going to find that impact on the broadcast medium, okay, where a lot of the new TV programs, if this strike goes more than a couple more weeks, you're going to find those shows are going to be delayed, and maybe we won't see new episodes of those until early next year. Maybe there won't be a season at all. This is kind of where things are at with broadcast. And so what the networks will do in the US is that they'll look for other ways to plug the programming. What we saw during the last strike is very much what we'll see here. More reality programs. We're going to see probably more importing of Canadian TV shows. And I noticed that the CW have just picked up the rights to the Australian surf drama Barons, which I don't know if we reviewed that on this podcast or not. I know I watched it.
I don't think we did. Yeah.
I may have discussed it. I'm not too sure. But yeah, that show's been picked up. It was like a 6 or 8 episode run from the ABC. So that's going to be playing on US TV. You're going to start seeing more of these shows being picked up. You're also going to start seeing companies like Paramount Global, who are in CBS in the US, they're going to be relying more on the international programs they've been making. So one of the things that will obviously make its way onto the air, going into production this week, NCIS Sydney. Okay, so that will be a program that you'll probably find on broadcast TV in the US, where if there wasn't a strike and there wasn't that gap, that would probably just be a Paramount Plus TV program in the US. So you've got those sort of elements at play. If the strike keeps on going, you're going to find an impact on the streaming services. So the streaming services usually have a much longer tail for their production. So they'll have a whole bunch of shows that they're ready to fire off in the next 6 months, which have largely finished filming and are just in states of post-production at this point, if not already in the can. So they're probably going to be okay for a while. And services like Netflix have so much foreign drama that even if that US supply of content dries up, then you're just going to start seeing that a lot of the foreign stuff that you're seeing is going to become more and more prominent on platform. There's optionality for a lot of these streamers. So it takes a lot of the power away from the writers, but ultimately most of the power is with the streaming services these days. So that's kind of where you need to really be paying attention.
During the week, the producers of House of the Dragon came out and said, hey, we've got scripts in the can. Everything's fine for us to continue filming. What happens
which is a bit of a misnomer as well, because it's a bit of a porky that they're telling, because scripts get revised on set all the time. So even though they've got finished scripts,
that's exactly
they're not
the
strictly
question.
Finished scripts. Yeah.
That's exactly the question I was about to ask, and this maybe impacts film more than it impacts the world of streaming series. What happens when, we're going into production, we've got to go, we've got a script finished, but halfway through the production, we've got to do a quick rewrite, or we've got to introduce another character to bridge something over.
Doesn't happen.
Scab labor doesn't happen.
No,
it can't happen. So
happen.
does that mean that those shows grind
it just means
down?
that they go with the script that's there. So you're just getting some subpar episodes that don't quite work as well as they should.
Okay, all right. So and we should point out that we're talking from a TV perspective here, but there's also the Writers Guild covers all writers on all things, including the big films we're hoping go into production. But that's going to grind to a halt as well. I don't remember how the WGA strike of 15 years ago impacted the film sector. I guess there's got to be some sort of impact there, but I don't recall.
There's such a longer tail for making a movie. So a script is written well in advance of going to production generally. Often there's a lot of rewrites and whatnot that happens, but scripts exist and you can kind of keep on making movies. I mean, the people that are going to find the impact here is people like your big franchise film projects. So like your Marvel films, for example, which is that constant churn of scripts going through and constant revisions. Those constant revisions will not be happening. And so that's probably where they'll find issues. But for a standard production where, there are so many scripts floating around that are in fairly filmable condition that no one's necessarily short of written materials to be able to film. but they won't be punched up by any means.
God knows that there's been plenty of movies made that are fairly filmable. So I think that the film industry should be fine. Okay, so that brings us up to date with the WGA strike. I knew Dan Barrett would bring incredible insight to the what you did during the week in the newsletter, mate, was terrific and brought it all into perspective. So do get on that. But that's
look, I got to say,
that's
it's
the end
hard
of our
to-
intermission bit.
I was just saying, it's hard doing the newsletter at the moment because very much a lot of the news is just strike orientated. So it's kind of like a daily missive from the battlefields of striking, which honestly, at the end of the first week, like it's pretty dull to put forward. I mean, there's high stakes involved and, certainly supporting the writers sort of through this, but at the same time, makes it a bit of a chore getting a newsletter out. So I'm doing what I can, people.
You heard it here first. The Always Be Watching screen letter is dull. Okay, let's go to our In History page. Do we have a sting in here? Let's not do one. In History. Okay, Dan Barrett, I'm putting you on the spot once again.
Okay, what do we got?
May 7, 1987, one of sitcom's great romantic pairings ends when which star left this hit series?
Okay, pretty certain this is going to be Sybil Shepherd having left Moonlighting.
It was Shelley Long leaving Cheers.
That was 87.
I thought you'd
Okay.
get that one. Yes. Yeah, well done.
Yeah, no, that
May
makes sense.
8, May 8, 1989, Media Watch premieres on the ABC, which is my goal to get the podcast on Screen Watch, on Media Watch somehow by saying something disgusting. With who in the host chair for episode 1?
I actually don't know this.
Stuart Littlemore.
Oh, he was
And on May
he was OG. Okay.
Yeah, OG. May 11, 1990, cast member Nora Dunn and guest Sinead O'Connor boycott SNL when which comedian is confirmed as host?
Okay, I'm pretty sure this is going to be, what's his name? Dice, Andrew Dice Clay.
The Dice Man himself, yes, the king of misogynistic offensive comedy, was confirmed as host, and Sinead and Nora said, I don't think so. Okay, this one's right up your alley. Birthdays.
No, not happy birthday. No, not that. Please, no, not happy birthday.
Dan Barrett, what do these birthday buddies all have in common? May 9, 1936, the great Albert Finney, late great. May 12, 1950, Gabriel Byrne. May 13, 1939, Harvey Keitel. And also May 13, but much later, 1986, one Robert Pattinson. 4 actors who all have one specific thing in common. They've played a role that, let's just say, exposed them for them who they really are.
Okay, well, I think that just kind of gave it away because I was looking at these names earlier in the week when you added them to the spreadsheet, and I was playing around with the idea that they were all in like vehicles that were moving forward, either forwards or backwards. And it makes sense when you start going through them. But clearly, I believe that they at some point appeared fully naked and showed the full Patterson would be my guess here.
Full frontal male nudity, my friend. Take your pick. Albert Finney did it in Under the Volcano. Gabriel Byrne did it in a film called Siesta. Harvey Keitel does it in every second film he makes. And Robert Pattinson did it in one called Little Ashes, in which he played a young Salvador Dali. So there you go. The male peen gets another look in on screen watching.
Okay, Simon, and that brings us to the end of the podcast.
Done. Good podcast, my friend. Well done.
That'll be for the historians to decide. But folks, while we wait for that, I'll thank you for listening to Screen Watching. My name is Dan Barrett. You can find me still on Twitter at the Dan Barrett. Blue Sky, I'm waiting for my invites. You start your day with my free newsletter. It's called Always Be Watching at alwaysbewatching.com. It's got the big stories in TV, streaming, and film. A newsletter which I must say, never dull. And then on Fridays, you've got the Always Be Streaming newsletter, which admittedly came out this morning on Saturday morning, and recounts the big shows that launched that very week.
I'm on Twitter at Simon R. Foster1. I'm on the web at screen-space.net. Our Facebook page at Screen Watching Podcast. Get the Birthday Buddies visual clue there before the podcast to have your guess. Go to at screen_watching on the Twitter, at screen_watching, I think, the YouTube channel where you can see my interview with Ellie Grapp for the film Olga, and email us at screenwatchingpodcast@gmail.com. Are you getting the better early stage of your Blue Sky thing yet? I signed up and haven't got anything. Are we getting any sort of early tact on that?
Nothing. I'd be in. If I was in, Simon, I'd give you an invite, but I'm not.
That's
so
true.
I can't.
All right. Looking forward to that. We can talk about that in the weeks ahead as well. And if you don't know what Blue Sky is, check it out, kids. It's the next social media platform to consume your lives.
It's basically Twitter, but not Twitter, which is exciting.
Oh, that's a good thing. Yeah, it is. Yeah. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Simon. We'll be back next week.